Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you are here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading Marcus Garvey and the Vision of Africa, Chapter 6, The Last Years, page 323.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
The Last Years, commentary by John Henrik Clarke. He would now go to the seat of the British Empire and petition directly for the redemption of Africa. He did not succeed. In fact, his presence in London caused the British no fear at all. The empire was spread around the world, and the sun was not setting on the British flag. It was the last of England's age of splendor, domination, and arrogance. They were not inclined to listen to this subject of the crown, who was acting like a citizen and demanding the basic rights that go with being a citizen. During the early part of Marcus Garvey's London years, the Italian-Ethiopian War had broken out and had destroyed his dream of a place in Africa where Africans could go and start nation building. He cautioned Haile Selassie, but to no avail, against leaving Ethiopia during its hour of trial. The last 5 years of Garvey's life were years in which he struggled to hold on to a semblance of the once great mass organization. Funds and supporters of the organization had dwindled almost to nothing, and while the Great Depression was over for a lot of white people due to the beginning of the war in Europe accentuating employment, this was not true in the Black community, where depressions come early and stay late. And so, the last years of Marcus Garvey were years in which he lived in poverty without losing one iota of the Jamaican maroon pride that had projected him out into the world 30 years before. His death came at a time when a lot of his predictions were coming to pass. European powers were engaged again in the massive world struggle, and the colonized people were once more beginning to defy European rule. The legacy that he left behind would be part of the stimulus for the African freedom explosion that would come 20 years later. In a long article in the magazine Race, published in London in 1967, the writer Richard Hart has said that The last 5 years of Marcus Garvey's life marked the decline in influence and popularity, almost to the point of oblivion, of a man who had once inspired millions. The statement was only partly true. The Italian-Ethiopian War we started soon after Marcus Garvey reestablished residence in London. This attack on Ethiopia, the last remaining independent African nation, awakened Black people around the world. It also gave rebirth to Garveyism. In the midst of this war and in the Depression years, many conservative Blacks became radical and nationalist, and a new political consciousness was born. A young Ghana student named Kwame Nkrumah came to the United States and began his studies in this atmosphere. During those years, he came under the influence of Garveyism. Black Americans were becoming more Africa conscious. The Italian-Ethiopian War was responsible for this new interest and anger about Africa. A number of study groups showed interest in African history. The best known of these groups was the Blyden Society, named after the great nationalist and benefactor of West Africa, Edward Wilmot Blyden. I personally remember Kwame Nkrumah attending several meetings of this society. The American Black press improved its coverage of news about Africa. In the reporting on the Italian-Ethiopian War, this press was fortunate in having in its service at least two reporters who had been well schooled in African history in general: J.A. Rogers, a historian and journalist, and Dr. Willis N. Huggins, historian, teacher, and community activist. In his dispatches from Ethiopia, J.A. Rogers gave an astute analysis of the war to the Pittsburgh Courier. He was the only reporter on the scene who was looking at the Italian-Ethiopian conflict from a Black point of view. Rogers also commented on the political intrigues in Europe that led to this conflict. Later, in a small book called The Real Facts About Ethiopia, he digested his reports and produced the most revealing document about the Italian-Ethiopian War that has so far appeared in print. Dr. Willis N. Huggins, a high school history teacher and founder of the Blyden Society for the Study of African History, went to Geneva and reported on the League of Nations meetings concerning the Italian-Ethiopian War for the Chicago Defender. Dr. Huggins had already written 2 books on Africa: A Guide to Studies in African History and Introduction to African Civilizations. The Back to Africa teaching of Marcus Garvey was now being reconsidered. The Harlem literary renaissance had died. The urban Black communities, especially in the North, were entering a renaissance of African consciousness and nationalism. The first nationwide Black student unions, which included African students from all over the continent, were formed. The attack on Ethiopians and the reemergence of Garveyism and the hardships of the Depression years had created a semblance of unity among Black Americans. Kwame Nkrumah's plans for the eventual independence of his country were formulated during his student years in the United States. In the book, Kwame Nkrumah by Bankole Timothy, we are told that Nkrumah dreamed of organizing all Africans in the United States so that they might return and perform useful services for Africa. He was the moving force behind the organizing of the first General Conference of Africans in America in September of 1942. At the same time, he dreamed of a West African Federation, together with Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria and Durosimi Johnson of Sierra Leone planned on returning to their respective countries to start political agitation toward this objective. While Kwame Nkrumah was finishing college in America and writing his important booklet, Toward Colonial Freedom, Marcus Garvey was in London trying to hold together the structure of the UNIA while war clouds were gathering in Europe. Miss Amy Jacques Garvey has written this account for her husband's last years. Miss Amy Jacques Garvey has written this account of her husband's last years. While in England, he published The Black Man as a monthly magazine. He had pneumonia in the winter of 1936. As all of the finances had to be used for the work of the organization, he did not send for his family until June of 1937. Every summer, he was allowed to go to Canada and conduct meetings and conferences which American Garveyites attended. In 1937, he left from Halifax and visited and spoke at all the port cities of the Leeward and Windward Islands down to Guyana. He had enthusiastic crowds and appreciative listeners. In June of 1938, Junior contracted rheumatic fever because the bedroom was not adequately carpeted. He was in the hospital with a drawn knee after the fever subsided. At the end of the summer, the specialist and the school teacher decided that as the knee could not keep straight without a plaster cast, he would have to be sent to an orthopedic home in the south of England, or I could take him back to the West Indies, as he needed sunshine on his limbs. This I did, and we stayed at my mother's home. Julius, who had bronchitis in the winter, was glad to be able to play outdoors all year round. Garvey was in Canada convening the 8th International Convention. He sent us $20 some months, but not regularly as money was coming in slowly. Agents did not pay promptly for the magazine, and rent and staff had to be paid. In January of 1940, he had the first paralytic stroke. His condition improved, but in May, a Black reporter in England maliciously gave out the news that Garvey had died in poverty in England. Cables and letters poured into the office, and although his secretary did not let him see them, he suspected that something was wrong by the constant ringing of the doorbell. He demanded to see the correspondence. When he saw the black streamer headlines of the Negro papers, he motioned to her that he wanted to dictate a statement, but he cried out loud in anguish and fell back on his pillow. He was unable to speak again, and the brave soul returned to his creator on the 10th of June, 1940. But his message to the world had been delivered. O Africa, awaken, the morning is at hand. No more art thou forsaken, O bounteous motherland. Far from far thy sons and daughters are hastening back to thee. Their cries ring o'er the waters that Africa shall be free. In his lifetime, Marcus Garvey managed to convey to African people that Africa was their homeland and it had to be reclaimed. The Black nationalists and freedom fighters before and after Marcus Garvey were saying no more or less than what Garvey had said in word and in deed. Up, up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will. And that was John Henrik Clarke's commentary. Greetings, Sister Raw. How are you tonight? I'm so glad you and the elders are here. Thanks for tuning in. The Last London Years, 1935 to 1940, by Rupert Lewis. Marcus Garvey left Jamaica in April of 1935 for England, where he reestablished the headquarters of the UNIA. Before leaving, he undertook a lecture tour of the island where he addressed audiences on the vision of a new Jamaica, and on his own platforms at Idlewives Park in Kensington, he spoke on the economic future of Jamaica. His activity was now being guided by the perspectives of the 1934 International Convention of the UNIA. Having been deported from the United States as an undesirable alien, Garvey was kept under strict surveillance in Jamaica, and his British passport was restricted, so he was barred from entering Central and South America republics where the UNIA was well organized among West Indian laborers. The American government, I don't know what's going on tonight. I'm having some technical difficulties. The American government kept Garvey away from his American supporters, and the British government from the Garveyites in Central and South American republics. Garvey's last 8 months in Jamaica had been hectic. He had presided over the 7th International Convention of Negro Peoples of the World in August of 1934, which coincided with the centenary of emancipation of blacks in the West Indies, then gone on to chair several private and public sessions of the Permanent Jamaica Development Convention, which had been formed by the Jamaican representatives attending the International Convention. The task of the Jamaica Convention was to consider proposals for social, economic, and cultural reconstruction of Jamaica. After outlining the plans, representations were made to the British government for the raising of $20 million Jamaican loan. Garvey had also started work on the 5-year plan, which had been decided on at the convention. After the International Convention and the Jamaica Convention, Garvey figured prominently in the very controversial 1935 election to the legislature. The only just way to write about Garvey's last London years is to reconstruct the vision that was not started in one man's head, but rooted in the historical movement of the colonized against the colonizer. After looking at the network of imperialist diplomacy, then we can deal with the fact of Secret Service agents in the organization. The most glaring case of this was the fact that the UNIA's legal advisor was in the pay of the American government, and after Garvey was indicted, he was appointed an assistant attorney general. Much of Garvey's activity in Jamaica can be understood as a contribution to the democratic movement in the West Indies, whose political testament was C.L.R. James, A Case for West Indian Self-Government, 1928. The principles on which the People's Political Party founded by Marcus Garvey were based are inherent in the memorandum Garvey addressed as a young man to Major Moton of Tuskegee Institute when he came to visit Jamaica in 1916. Garvey wrote, "If you desire to do Jamaica a turn, you might ask those around you on public platforms to explain to what proportion the different people here enjoy wealth and resources of the country. Impress this and let them answer for the publication, and then you will have the whole farce in a nutshell." In Jamaica, Garvey brought the racial question to the forefront. He did so by distinguishing between racism in America and that in the West Indies. Here, Garvey is not concerned primarily with discrimination by itself, but sees that correctly in sequential terms, We have to grasp the significance of the principles which guided Garvey's activities. If we don't, then we see him undertaking a multiplicity of tasks, forming a political party, publishing newspapers, pamphlets, writing poetry, and holding an international organization together. And then we fall back to redemptive understanding based on Black Moses. These principles bear out the essential unity of his activities. They were developed and agreed on by members of the international organization. In the United States, Garvey had said, to fight for African redemption does not mean that we must give our domestic fights for political justice and industrial rights. That is the first principle. That is the first principle. The second is found in a confidential booklet of information and instructions to presidents of UNIA divisions written in 1929, and it reads, the culmination of all the efforts of the UNIA must end in a Negro independent nation on the continent of Africa. This is to say, everything must be contributed toward the final objective of having a powerful nation for the Negro race. Negro nationalism is necessary. It is a political power and control. Greetings, Forecast. How are you tonight? Garvey's activity in Jamaica was not based on a decision to do his best, his next best where he was, for he had worked out the basis for his activity in the colonial outpost, which was also his home, and this excluded subjective meanderings. In Jamaica, an international movement took on its national form whose particular expression was developed within boundaries marked off by British colonial rule in plantation society. In Jamaica, the UNIA fought against great odds, not least among them being the colonial bureaucracy, whose post office security did what the restricted passport was incapable of. The lesson was clear. No international organization could function effectively in a colonial outpost. Apart from the Black Moses understanding of Garvey, we also need to combat the very subjectivist view of a dejected Garvey, which had been swept into the last London years. No movement which is historically based can be understood in these terms. Garvey had no illusions as to where his vision came from. As he wrote in reply to a Costa Rican evangelist who was his supporter and saw him as a prophet, he said his vision was based on the practical side of life. Garvey himself was then combating the Black Moses understanding. The last London years stand in clear perspective only in relation to this whole. 1935 was an important year for the struggle of colonial peoples against imperialism, a struggle accelerated by the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. Not only did Marcus Garvey arrive in London that year, but also George Padmore, C.L.R. James discusses these years in a series of articles, Notes on the Life of George Padmore, written for the Nation newspaper, of which he was the editor in Trinidad. Padmore was first active in the International African Friends of Ethiopia, organized by James. Among its members were Jomo Kenyatta, Durosimi Johnson of Sierra Leone. The International African Friends of Ethiopia became the International African Bureau, which Padmore was in charge of. James expresses the theoretical basis for their political activity this way. Between 1930 and 1939, All of us saw African emancipation as dependent upon the breakdown of imperialist power in Europe. Armed rebellion was sure to be crushed unless the imperialist powers were potent, and this could only be the result of revolutions within the metropolitan powers themselves. The theory is very clearly stated in the book, The Black Jacobins. There are two other quotations from James's article without which the last London years cannot be understood. The first one is related to the revolutionary significance of the International African Bureau specifically, but it is a general commentary on the importance of anti-colonial struggle outside of Africa itself. And that is, the Africans have told us that the movement was kept alive and its continuity was maintained by the work that we did in London and distributed to the African territories. The second deals with the relationship between Africans and West Indians in London. The Africans were not politically active, but it was clear that they were rebellious in spirit and resented not only West Indians, but the whole British regime, which they identified with the maintenance of colonialism. Most West Indians in London at the time embodied general British colonial rationalizations of themselves and other people. Garvey had written about this and tried to show the educated West Indian what had been made of him. James points out that he was an exception and completely accepted by the Africans precisely because these rationalizations had been negated. In London, Garvey set up the headquarters of the UNIA. In Hyde Park, he has his own platform. There are reports in the Jamaican press of Garvey attracting thousands and also of him taking the reactionary side in relation to colonialism at a Hyde Park debate between him and an English socialist. At this time, Garvey was arguing the need for Black colonial representation in the imperial legislature, but the outpost legislature was ineffective. He was beginning to claim partly, he was basing this claim partly on the representation of French colonials and their imperial legislature. Moreover, he had been delegated by the Jamaica Convention in September of 1934 to make representations to the British Secretary of State for the colonies for raising the $20 million loan. The continuity of his work is evident in that he not only solicited a reply from non-commitment from the Secretary of State, but was working with the Jamaica Convention, which exists not in name but in action. Again, the platform understanding of Marcus Garvey is incomplete without bearing in mind the actual relations of the organization pitted in an objective war with imperialism and the tactics he had to employ. The actual relations forestalled opportunism, though they couldn't stop it, as several leading Garveyites clung to their greedy tactics and were lost to the whole unity of the struggle for African redemption. To grasp the actual relations we have to move outside the UNIA itself to consider the West African Student Union, the Colonial Seamen's Union, West and African and West Indian seamen, and the West Indian labor revolt in the late 1930s. Garvey's contact with the West African Students Union was Lepido Solanke. Miss Amy Jacques Garvey relates that at times her husband financed the publication called WASU, and that this contact was an underground one. Ladipo Solanke contributed an article to the July and August 1936 issue of the Black Man magazine, in which he discussed life and conditions in West Africa. African seamen were of great importance as they were purveyors of the UNIA literature, confidential correspondence, and firsthand information on developments in Africa. This made them invaluable propagandists. Several of these seamen had married who themselves were involved in UNIA work, for example, distributing handbills during Garvey's Hyde Park meetings and performing other tasks. They could not become members of the UNIA, but an auxiliary of the organization was formed for them because they were white. Garvey left Jamaica in 1935 with colonial state officials in panic at the number of disturbances occurring in the country. During the election campaign, the Riot Act had to be read in one country parish, and labor organizations had sprung up among the workers and the unemployed. A weekly newspaper known as Plain Talk had started publication at the printery which had earlier published Garvey's newspapers and pamphlets. Plain Talk had started out gingerly by supporting progressive politicians in the Jamaican legislature and reporting on the activities of the UNIA in Jamaica. However, it got caught up in the forward movement of agricultural and industrial labor in the Caribbean and had to develop, though it did not do so in a revolutionary way. The paper's development also owed much to the Ethiopian cause, in which Plain Talk played the leading journalistic role in the British Caribbean. One of the important political documents published in Plain Talk came from the International African Bureau and was signed by George Padmore and Wallace Johnson, a memorandum to the West Indies Commission investigating the strike among the oil field workers in Trinidad. It started out by stating the political position of the African Bureau. The strikes in Trinidad have been basically for economic demands, but they have taken a form which prove conclusively that the population of the island has reached a stage far beyond the construction under which it is governed. The International African Service Bureau claims that the future of Trinidad and other West Indian islands should be decided by the people themselves. Garvey at this time was returning from Canada after attending the 1937 Regional Conference of the UNIA. His boat had stopped at several Eastern Caribbean ports and also in Guyana. He also he was also allowed entry to Trinidad, but not permitted to speak because of the unrest caused by the oil field workers' strike, and the colonial officials evidently saw his speeches as adding more oil to the fire of labor. Before he left for the summer conference in Canada, Garvey had written a memorandum on behalf of about 70,000 West Indian laborers in Cuba as the Cuban government was repatriating them by the hundreds. This was published not only in Plain Talk, but in a number of other newspapers, including the Panama Tribune, whose editor was a Garveyite. On the basis of this memorandum, Garvey made many representations to the British Secretary of State for the colonies once more. Garvey wrote, "Several years ago, owing to the very bad economic conditions then prevailing in certain of the British West Indian islands, namely Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, the Windward Islands, Leeward Islands, large numbers of British West Indian Negroes were forced to leave their respective countries for the Republic of Cuba, where there was a boom in the sugar and banana industries." He discusses the travails of the West Indian laborer working in these countries and goes on to state near the end of the memorandum that The different West Indian islands from which these migrants hail have resources sufficient within them to guarantee proper employment to these people if they should be returned. But the governance of these resources must be undertaken not by private ownership, which is always selfish, but under government direction without prejudice to the class of people who need consideration and assistance. When he wrote to the West Indies labor riots in the Black Man, when he wrote of the West Indies labor riots in the Black Man magazine, Marcus Garvey made his position clear. We are glad the Jamaica laborer was struck. He has struck at a time when those at the helm in England were making much of imperial unity. Britain was a declining imperial power, so she had to make much of the myth of imperial unity in order to hold her shaky empire together. Labor in the British Caribbean at this time was fulfilling its historical task. No one else, especially those at the pinnacle of the oppression, could stop that. The historical role was grasped by Garvey when in the article he pointed out money and color count in Jamaica more than anything else, and it would take more than a colonial governor, or an ordinary imperial colonel, colonial secretary, to change the class distinctions and improve the economic conditions to the benefit of the poorer people in Jamaica. The Black Man magazine published not only articles discussing the Italian invasion, seeing it as the start of the Second World War, but also poetry and biographies of Ethiopian warriors, so fulfilling the vital journalistic role of E.U. Ison Udom in his study of Black nationalism has dealt with the support of Garvey organizations in America gave to the Ethiopian cause. The attitude that Garvey took toward Haile Selassie after he arrived in England from Abyssinia was bitterly criticized, but this is how he viewed the situation. Haile Selassie ruled over a state with more than 12 million people and one of the richest in the world in natural resources. His best friends surely cannot compliment him for leaving that country in the hands of a foreign foe and by the methods he adopted. He kept his country unprepared for modern civilization, whose policy was strictly aggressive. He resorted sentimentally to prayer and to the feasting and fasting, not consistent with the policy that secures the existence of present day freedom for peoples, whilst other nations and rulers are building up armaments of the most destructive kinds as the only means of securing peace and protection. The results show that God had nothing to do with the campaign of Italy and Abyssinia. For on the one side, we had the Pope of the Catholic Church blessing the crusade, and on the other, the Coptic Church fasting and praying with confidence of victory. The Italians triumphed by the use of mustard gas. It is logical, therefore, that God did not take sides, but left the matter to be settled by the strongest human battalion. In leaving his London headquarters on his regular summer trips to Canada for the regional conferences of the UNIA, Garvey usually left detailed instructions on the running of the office. In 1938, in Instructions for Mrs. Garvey, he writes, all employees are supposed to report for work at 9 a.m. I leave at 1 p.m., return at 2 p.m., and work each and every day up to 5 p.m. Any employee who is absent half an hour in any day will not be paid for the amount of time and if more than 2 hours in a week, the same to be deducted by the end of that week. There shall be no leave of absence during my absence, and any absence from work shall not be paid for that particular time. These instructions were in fact written for the 5 employees of the organization, his wife, 2 contributing editors to the Black Man magazine, one of whom was the chief clerk of the office, an English stenographer, and Garvey's private secretary. Finances were very low, and he had budgeted down to the last cent. One understands the need for such careful budgeting when one reads the financial statement presented in Toronto at the UNIA convention. Salary and miscellaneous to Mr. Garvey from June 1935 to June 1938 amounted to 1,000 US dollars. The weekly payroll for the headquarters amounted to $22 Jamaican. The English stenographer was given the special task of mailing out lessons for the School of African Philosophy. The School of African Philosophy, Garvey said, was the result of 5 years of planning. It was based on the recognition that in 23 years of the UNIA's existence, it had not paid attention to training new leadership. The School of African Philosophy was based on a study of the organization's work over the last 2 decades and related to concrete tasks that division presidents had to do. It covered 42 subjects based on the UNIA and ACL's work. Garvey maintained regular correspondence with his family after they returned to Jamaica in September of 1938 due to the illnesses of Marcus Jr. and expressed concern for their security in writing. I shall not be returning to Jamaica, and in case anything happens to me, I want you to know that I have opened a post office account at the West Kensington North End Row, West 14th Post Office in your name. In another letter, he assured his sons that the organization would take care of them after he died. It was, of course, unable to. His final handwritten letter to his sons was dated January 6th of 1940. Very soon after that, he suffered a second serious stroke, and all his letters had to be dictated to his secretary or written by one of his assistants with the usual 5 Jamaican dollars enclosed for pocket money. At times, he attempted to scrawl Dad at the end of the letter. However, by now, Garvey was gravely handicapped and unable to resume a normal life. His private secretary confided in a letter to his wife, if anything happened to him, he wanted his body sent to his UNIA people in Jamaica. Garvey died June 10, 1940, during the Blitz in London. The UNIA was the first major vehicle to carry the principles of Garveyism, and its worldwide activities accelerated the African Revolution. Because of this, Garveyism moved into the mainstream of the African struggle on the home front. Since the UNIA's work had to be underground and anonymous, it was known only to a few patriots. That is why Garvey said in his 1937 Toronto address to the Detroit delegation, those of you who thought the UNIA was dead or is dead have made a terrible mistake. It hasn't started to live in its reality. During these last years, Garvey made some fundamental observations about the organization. Garvey saw himself like this. If I were of another age, I probably would not see the need for the UNIA. It happens to be true that I am a child of the 20th century and I do things that are right. that are done within the period which I was born. If I were of another age, I probably would not see the need of the UNIA. Another type of person would have bureaucratized the UNIA in terms of a sterile Black nationalism. But this time, Garvey was lopping off sections of the UNIA which had become redundant. At the 1938 convention, he took the position in a debate about the legions, the military section of the UNIA, that it ought to be disbanded. Garvey made a number of errors, but on fundamental issues, he was hardly ever wrong. The Garvey movement was a historical praxis of anti-imperialist struggle. It is with this fact in mind that we understand Marcus Garvey and his creativity. Everything he did developed concretely out of the struggle he was involved in and had committed his life to. In a speech to a London audience in 1928, Garvey said, "But the new Negro is also thinking in terms of perpetual motion. The Negro is also thinking in terms of the hidden mysteries of the world. And you do not know what the oppressed and suppressed Negro, by virtue of his condition and circumstances, may give to the world as a surprise." It is with a conception like this, one in mind, that one can understand Garvey's impatience with Black intellectuals and also with the cultural criticism of creative artists like Claude McKay and Paul Robeson. Garvey was spiritually religious. He believed that his creator had endowed him with an unquenchable spirit as man to struggle and survive, to fail and to go right on trying to attain the goal. Seeing the masses of his people at the base in poverty and frustration, he said, "My place is with them, not looking down at them, but helping them to reach the top en masse." In order to fully rehabilitate the race, he had to reorient their religious concepts. So he established the African Orthodox Church with Bishop George Alexander McGuire as titular head. These church groups in Africa played a great part in spreading Garveyism. Through the International Convention, he proclaimed a bold concept visualizing the Creator God as Black in our own image and likeness, the mother of the Redeemer as a saintly Black woman like the Madonna at Guadalupe, and Simon the Cyrenian, the bearer of the cross, as a Black man. Psychologically, this heightened the religious fervor of the masses, giving them new courage to strive for creative perfection as children of a dusky deity. During those last London years, Garvey never departed from the principles which had guided his historical task. Neither imprisonment, betrayal, nor financial deprivation could deter his activities or lead him despondently as he saw the forward movement of colonial peoples gaining momentum against imperialism. So as you can see, Marcus Garvey had quite a few goals, and he got quite a bit of support from African peoples, even in places where Africans and West Indians didn't get along. I'm going to stop reading right there for today because I try hard to only hold you guys for an hour, and the past couple of days it's been longer than that. I will be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I will be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time so that we can go on and continue our reading of the last years of Marcus Garvey. I thank each and every one of you I want to give a special appreciation to Sister Raw and the elders, Afro Native, Bawana Haguziki, The Forecast, Brother Bakari, Tinkerbell 87, Jesse's Kids Academy, and the Daycare Ladies Network. I thank each and every one of you for coming by today, and I will see you tomorrow. Peace, guys. Thanks for listening.